Hi everyone and welcome to another episode of From the Lighthouse. I'm Stephanie and I'm here today with Jimmy. Hi Jimmy.
Hi Steph.
And not Michelle. Michelle unfortunately had other countries to be in. And we're here with a special guest today who is Dr. Lee O'Brien, who is a lecturer in the Department of English here at Macquarie University. Hi Lee.
Hi Stephanie.
Hello,
Jimmy.
Lee is a 19th century scholar who usually writes on women's lyric poetry, and as well as George Eliot. She's been doing a bit of work on George Eliot quite recently. She's also writing a very exciting sounding book on women's writing of the 1790s and 1890s with one of her colleagues, whose name might be Stephanie. And we're here today to talk to her, though, about her work on crime fiction. So she's just had an article published in Clues on the writings of Gladys Mitchell, and so we thought we'd bring Lee in today to talk to her about the golden age crime novelist Gladys Mitchell. So, who is Gladys Mitchell?
So, who is Gladys Mitchell?
Yeah.
Well, she's a wonderful writer for starters. She was born at the beginning of the 20th century, 1901. She died in 1983. She wrote a few novels that were rejected by publishers, but then she got Speedy Death accepted in 1929. Mm-hmm. So she was actually quite a young woman when she started writing the Mrs. Lestrange, Mrs. Bradley detective stories, which is wonderful because her detective is a very old woman, and I love the paradox of that. She's a bit of a new woman.
Fantastic.
We talk a lot about
We do
women.
talk a lot about new women.
And yeah. she inherits that whole intellectual ethos of the new woman and making women intellectually engaged and physically strong. She was a school teacher for most of her professional life. She was actually an Olympic athlete. I don't know if she actually competed in one of the Olympics, but she was very physically inclined as well as intellectually brilliant. So she uses her experience, I think, she never married. She uses her experiences as a school teacher and a headmistress as the plots of a lot of her novels. A lot of her novels are set in schools and convents and that sort of closed order. And she had lots of very close women friends. Some of the epigraphs and dedications of the novels are very moving. So she was clearly part of a very supportive network of women friends, and a lot of them writers too. The other person she was very close to was her brother. She had a wonderful, very close family relationship as far as I know. There's only one interview with her, sadly enough. So I don't know much more than that about her private life, her non-writing life.
She had a long career, didn't she? Very
long, yes. She died in 1983, and once she got published, she more or less pumped out a novel every year, right from 1929 right through to 83.
Wow.
The Crozier Pharaohs, which are actually a breed of dog.
Oh.
That's a Mrs. Bradley novel that was published posthumously after she died. So she starts in the Golden Age, but like Agatha Christie, her career goes way beyond Golden Age detective fiction into a time when detective fiction didn't sort of change dramatically, and spy thrillers and a whole lot of different popular forms had taken over in the 70s, 60s, 70s and later, but she still stuck with it.
Yep.
As Agatha Christie did. She wasn't as popular in America as Christie. In fact, she has nowhere near the sales as Christie.
I was going to say, why is it that we know Agatha Christie and we know, Sayers, but we don't know her?
I don't know. Partly I think it's because for some reason she wasn't as popular in America, and when you crack the American market, that tends to give people visibility. I think it has to do a lot with her detective, Mrs. Bradley, who's this fascinatingly old, withered, witch-like figure, and she's just so powerful, and she's not like Miss Marple. Miss Marple has that kind of protective fluffiness, even though Miss Marple's a bit sudden death. But Mrs. Bradley is really quite confronting, and she makes her very ugly. She has appalling dress sense. She dresses like a macaw with all these clashing colours. and she has these withered hands. The only thing beautiful about her is her voice. So I think, to answer your question, I think it's, I think a lot of people were just put off by Mrs. Bradley.
Yeah.
And she had to soften the character a little bit later on. But for the first 30 or so novels, she's got this wonderfully lurid, aggressive, fascinating, strange, unconventional. The reptilian imagery is there endlessly.
Yeah,
yes.
I mean, that's one of the things I was really surprised and delighted by with the description of Mrs. Bradley throughout this entire novel. You know, she's constantly being compared to birds or reptiles,
or crocodile,
crocodile and a pterodactyl. And I think the first description of her was that she reminded him of a pterodactyl on display somewhere.
That's right. I've got that. Yes, she was dry without being shriveled and bird-like without being pretty. She reminded Alistair Bing, who was afraid of her, of the reconstruction of a pterodactyl he'd once seen in a German museum. There was the same inhuman malignity in her expression as in that defunct bird, and like it, she had a cynical smoke about her mouth even when she was in repose. She possessed nasty, dry, claw-like hands, and her arms, yellow and curiously repulsive, suggested the plucked wings of a vowel. Now, you ask me why she's not. I fell in love with her straight away, but you ask why she's not. But what you're saying about the reptile stuff is really interesting, because I think you would pick this up, there are mythic resonances.
There are so many mythic resonances throughout this entire novel, and with...
So you're talking about Speedy Death, the first novel.
Speedy Death, sorry, I should mention that. And for me, it was fascinating because Mrs. Bradley is unlike most detectives you will have ever encountered, especially during this stage when the detective was getting humanized through these various different incarnation, and then suddenly you have someone who's the complete opposite of that. You know, she goes to great lengths to almost turn into an animal, this highly intelligent animal-like creature.
She's predatory.
Yeah, she's very predatory, and she takes great joy out of all the manipulation that she does and all the way that she handles the situation. There's one description that I just couldn't help but laugh at, and it was a picture of Mrs. Bradley in her dressing gown, and they said, in her dressing gown she was even more unattractive than she was outside of it.
She has very lurid dressing gowns with dragons and things.
And I thought, oh dear, this poor woman, never gets a break at all. But at the same time, she then, for me anyway, harkened back to an older tradition, which was Marion Halcombe. Marion Halcombe was described as hideously ugly, but
in The Woman in White.
With her, I think, monobrow or something like that, or moustache, that's what it was. She had a moustache, and she was meant to be this hideous figure, but so intelligent that people were attracted to her.
It takes a lot of courage to make an ugly woman, particularly the ugly old woman, the centerpiece of your stories.
Yeah.
I mean, that's taking a risk.
Yeah, that's right.
And, it didn't pay off in the sense that she's not... I think she deserves to be every bit as widely read as Christie, but I don't think she's going to be, ever.
I mean, and it's not to say that Christie doesn't have this too, but I mean, I've read, I think, about 5 or 6 of these novels on your recommendation. And what struck me about Gladys Mitchell novels is that she's more willing to kind of go there in terms of exposing how terrible most people are. All of her characters are really terrible people. She's not. She doesn't really pull any punches.
No, she doesn't. And the families are toxic families.
They are.
Speaking of our other undying love, Georgette Heyer, if we're allowed to mention that.
Of course.
Heyer's the same. She exposes the family dynamics as mostly really nasty.
And when
and most of the murders come in.
Yeah, that's right. Most of the murders are in the family. And when Mrs. Bradley comes in, she knows she has a lot of fun with that.
Yes, she does.
She doesn't. She doesn't kind of moralize. She just sort of has fun picking at how terrible all these people are, and all the various ways, even if they're not the murderer, all the various ways that they're capable of cruelty.
Yes, and selfishness, and you're right, she's very uncompromising in a lot of things, and the social observation, and she's dark. You mentioned the humour. That's in all the novels. It's very funny. You find yourself bursting out laughing at some of the images and the things she says. And there's this black humour that wends its way all the way through. It's a kind of modern element to it.
Yeah, I mean, and it's very clever in that aspect. You talk about the family. I noticed one of the mention of Mrs. Bradley, which I was making that connection while I was reading it, was that she appeared in an almost Medea-like manner.
Oh, absolutely.
And in a novel like this, when you're talking about the horrible family with the absent mother, in that case, she almost takes on that mother figure, and it almost foreshadows what's going to happen later on, in a very clever way. And it is a very dark novel, and I think, possibly one of the reasons why she may not be as successful is because it takes the detective into an area that at this period in time people were not prepared to see the detective go.
No.
I mean, I think it's actually a very modern or contemporary novel, I should say. I think if she published this now, it would be much better received than the time that she actually published it then, because now we have a lot of novels like this where the detective can be seen in a very amoral,
lone wolf type thing.
Whereas back then, I think it would have insulted or confronted a lot of the people back then, and they wouldn't have been ready for the detective to
And
go
it's
in this
interesting
direction.
what you say about the nature of the detective, because with Dorothy Sayers you've got Lord Peter Wimsey, the aristocrat. The same with Marjorie Allingham. You've got Campion, who apparently is a member of the royal family somehow, and all their authority comes from this upper class male thing that Sayers and Allingham play on all the time. And I think what's really interesting about Mitchell is that she allows a woman to have genuine power. She does, as you say, Stephanie, she doesn't pull her punches. She doesn't soften things. She allows that power to operate. And some of her readers really hated that. You see, in that she says a lot of people got really irritated by Mrs. Bradley's manner. She has this witch-like cackle, and she keeps prodding people in the wrists, in the ribs. I mean, and so she had to soften that later. She said she took a lot of that strange stuff out.
And there's a lot of comparison of Mrs. Bradley with witches. I mean, I think again one of the first description is that if we had lived in less current times, she would have been burned as a witch.
Well, that's right, and that raises some really interesting questions about the characterization too, because Mitchell was a great expert in folklore, in British folklore, and the pagan. And it's an open question. I've changed my mind a lot about it, about whether we're to read Mrs. Bradley as actually being a witch. And I think it or a sibyl. Jimmy, you've done work on myth and detection. She's also one of the kindly ones, the Eumenides, Nemesis, the Furies.
Yes.
She has this mythic power to bring justice.
Yes, by her own hand.
Yes, exactly.
Which
is what
she does. She takes it into her own hands to say, well, I mean, for me, the ending is actually very mythic in the sense of
spoiler warning.
Yes, sorry, spoiler
warning.
Spoiler warning. If you are not,
the spoiler alarm's going off.
Yes, if you're planning on reading this novel, now would be a good time to pause this and put it aside and come back.
Because we're going to spill it.
Because we're going to spill it. Because I can't help but talk about
the
ending.
Such a great
it's
ending.
so spectacular, and I do want to talk about it. But yes. If you're planning on reading the novel, please pause now. So it reminded me very much of the Aristean myth. So she almost comes in like this Athena-like figure, and so say, well, you know what? What's going to happen is you're going to kill you, and you're going to kill you, and then everybody's just going to die, and it's just going to be horrible. Why don't I take this on board? I'm going to stop it, and they can't pin it on me because I'm too clever to pin it on me. So I'm just going to stop it right here. And she does, and she commits this rather. It's brilliant, but at the same time, it's very confronting. I think, because
well, it's cold-blooded murder.
It is
cold-blooded
cold-blooded
murder. She
murder.
poisons a woman in front of witnesses.
And she sets it up very. She plans the entire thing very meticulously. And she basically commits the perfect murder because everybody knows she did it. And nobody can prove that she did it. Even her own son sort of said, "Well, you did it, didn't you, Mummy?"
Yeah.
She's like, "Well, of course I did it."
I did it.
But I mean, but again, like,
Who else?
can you imagine the audacity of Gladys Mitchell to write her first detective novel using this detective and have the detective be the murderer?
Yes, exactly.
It's unbelievable.
Yes, I love that about her. That she does it a few more times in the novel. She bumps them off.
And
if she thinks they're not going to come to justice.
And I was reading your article, and it reminded me that in Death at the Opera, she writes a letter to the murderer that says, "Oh, that was really clever. The way that you carried out that murder, I really admire you. That was such a clever way of carrying out murder. Only somebody as smart as me would have been able to pick it up. Tops work to you, mate.
yours forever or something.
Yeah, yours forever. Yeah.
I mean, I think she does have her precursors, in other detective figures. Certainly, Sherlock Holmes was one of the first to allow a murder to go
unsolved.
or rather to say, I'm not going to look at this particular case at all.
Yes.
But I can't think of a detective that actually goes ahead and kills
yes.
somebody, or in this case, kills the criminal.
That's
because it would just have been too dangerous to allow the
Yes.
criminal to.
And I think there's an added fish on there because she's a woman, and
Yeah.
an older
Yes.
woman who's not supposed to be behaving. We have these kind of cultural stereotypes around
Yes.
older women and how they behave.
Yes, yeah, and they are powerless. They're usually powerless.
Yeah.
And what I like too is a lot of the young male characters respond to her. They sense something about her, and although she puts them at odds a bit, they and so do the young women. They actually like her.
Yeah.
There's that thing about her. So it's really interesting how she does it. She makes her on the surface so unattractive and just awful, but she has this wonderful, almost seductive quality about her.
Well, I think in a way her job explains it. The psychoanalysis or
Yes.
the psychoanalyst in her,
Yes.
she draws people in because she's a
Yes.
keen observer
Yes.
of what they are, and she's
Yes.
observed that people love to talk about themselves.
Yes.
They give them a chance,
Yeah.
and that's one of her main
Yeah.
skills. She can
Yeah.
draw people in and draw their stories
Yeah.
out.
See, that's interesting too, because she's also a Freudian.
Yes.
She's a psychoanalyst, the talking cure. She's a doctor, so she's a healer. And in Come Away Death, the snake imagery really takes over in some fascinating novel. They go to Greece and they reenact the Dionysian mysteries or whatever. But the linking of her with the snake is a symbol of doctors and healing. And there's a lot. Mitchell links Mrs. Bradley quite explicitly with that mythic healing. But as you know, in myths, healing can be a bit of a devastating thing. There can be a high body count when things are sorted out. So it's that paradoxical healing and killing, curing and killing. And I really like what you say about the way she works against the stereotypes. No, people don't wish to see old women as figures of power.
Well, people don't really wish to see old women at all. They're very, very
exactly.
absent. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Who wants to know?
They're very absent from literature and from film and television.
Yes, especially as major central characters. They can be sort of off in the woodwork as a minor character, but
or when they do appear, they're beautiful or they're youthful.
Yes.
And she's so ugly.
Yes.
And she makes such a point of her ugliness that I think it's really remarkable that we get this.
Yes.
With none of the softness, as you say, of a Miss Marple type. She's very abrasive.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, she almost proudly displays her ugliness, doesn't she?
She does.
She does.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
she
while I
draws
was reading
attention
this,
to it.
I thought it went. For her unattractiveness is actually her disguise. Because I'm very interested in the idea that detectives really disguise themselves because that's the way that they can get the truth out of people. And for me, Marple does it with her age by appearing like a senile
knitting and all
old
this.
woman.
Fluffy knitting.
Yeah. So that's her disguise.
Yeah.
But with Mrs. Bradley, it's almost as if she's saying, well, if I'm ugly, that's going to be my disguise. I'm going to show how ugly I am. So you're so distracted by my ugliness, and you're not actually seeing anything else. And she almost seems to just revel in this ugliness. And so every description of her is about that reptilian, and also that crocodile, that crocodilian
alligators,
smile.
bird-like.
But at the same time, there's an unusually strange connection between all these different animals. Birds, reptiles, being shown to be part of the same family now. So she's almost been thrown into that same group. But at the same time, there's something very predatory about those animals.
Very much so.
And she's a very, very. She's almost at the top of the predator.
She knew her home stories really well, and I think she's picking up aspects of Sherlock Holmes' characterization, because Holmes is a predator, he's a hunter, and I think that's right. He's described as a bird of prey in one of the stories, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
And so she picks up and the nature of the detective as actually a hunter, and if they get the murderer, well, death is going to unfold, because the murderer there was capital punishment when she was writing, so the murderer is going to be killed. That's something that Dorothy Sayers tried to soften with Lord Peter Wimsey. She kept making Wimsey really upset about the fact, what am I doing? I'm bringing justice, but this person is going to be hanged for the crime. Mrs. Bradley doesn't worry about any of that.
She doesn't care. She enjoys it. She loves it.
It's the hunt, and it's this satisfying, fulfilling. Things are made good as much as she can make them good, even though it is by violent means.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
And I think one of the actual genius of the novel also is the fact that we actually do find out who the criminal is very early on in the novel.
Yes.
And yet the suspense is still there because I'm thinking, is she actually the criminal?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
is she tricking me somehow?
Yes.
And then right till the end, I thought it went, okay, so she is the criminal. You know, so she actually keeps that suspense all the way throughout. And I think it's a testament to the character itself. The fact that she, because she's so clever, you're always thinking, well, is she lying? Is she lying to this character? Is she lying to that character? And you never quite get an insight into her. I think she becomes as much a mystery to the reader as she is to the characters.
That's very perceptive. I think that she picks up on that in later novels. If you love the novels and stay with them, you're sort of drawn into that world where you trust her knowledge. And it's never really explained. You know how you get it in Sherlock Holmes? He's done all these studies, he's got his criminal volumes of every crime and blah, blah, blah. She doesn't do any of that. It's very much at that level of intuition and knowledge. And so her mechanisms are never really explained. And some people find that irritating because she makes these leaps all through. The plots are totally bizarre, a lot of them. And that upset a lot of people too. I mean,
Philip quite complex too, isn't
incredibly complex.
Yeah.
Philip Larkin, the poet, loved her. He called her the Great Gladys.
Oh, that's
And
nice.
he said he thought she was a novelist, not a detective novelist. She was a great novelist. And he said that in some of the stories you don't know who did it, but you're not even quite sure who's been murdered.
That's right.
And she takes that formula idea with these complex plots and she just ramps it up. There's a level of the absurd. But I find that it's odd because I've written about the novel of The Rising of the Moon, which I think is her best novel. And there's a humanity about the way things unfold that comes through Mrs. Bradley's understanding of human frailty. So she's like a doctor, she sort of cuts out the diseased bits, but she's remarkably non-judgmental. So there's all that kind of interesting stuff that unfolds.
I mean, even with this novel, I think the humanity of Mrs. Bradley is I mean, it's a very unconventional type of humanity.
Very.
But when you think about it, what she's arguing is, in a way, for the greater good. You know? So what am I to do here? Am I to wait until this person has caused tragedy in everybody else's life? Or should I do what a good surgeon would do and, and cut off the cancerous part and allow the rest of the family to rebuild itself?
She has a real sense of like championing the underdog of the person who's been abused or is being neglected.
Yes.
And that's a very nice kind of
It is, you're right.
relatable characteristic.
It's part of that humanity. She's a very humane vision, I think.
Yeah,
but at the same time, there's also something strangely supernatural about her as well. You know, there's that scene I was thinking of, and I thought it was just such a fabulous scene where the two men cannot control Eleanor. You know, she's gone absolutely, she's like frothing at the mouth, she's biting at them, and then in comes this Bradley and says, you know, you're very tired now, you're getting up and you're moving. It's almost like she hypnotizes this poor girl and, you know, puts her in place, and she has complete command and control. You know, two grown men cannot control this girl, and this, you know, ugly little old, you know, reptilian woman comes along and boom,
that's it.
she gets her, and then she kills her, of course, after that particular incident. But you know,
minor complication.
Minor complication. But the fact that, you know, she is such a powerful figure really comes through in that scene.
Uncompromisingly so.
and the way she tends to like turn up when she's most needed, like she just mysteriously sort of appears.
Yeah, she does.
At the exact right moment. Like usually, I mean, after some sort of crime has taken place in some cases, but in other cases she's the crime. But anyway, but she just appears in exactly the right moment somehow, and it's never quite clear how. She's just there all of a sudden.
And I think too, there's feminist elements to that underdog thing, because a lot of the underdogs in the story, I mean, she's got a lot of young women who are, or middle-aged women who are serial killers and have to be pumped off. But she's also got a whole, you know, gallery of really sympathetic female characters. And I love this. In one of the stories, she lets the young woman murderer get off because she's actually killed the council officer who wouldn't let her get a scholarship or something. Mrs. Bradley says, I can actually understand why you needed him out of the way. So as part of that black humour, and it's sort of, but it has a moral force beyond the conventional, and she's playing with those ideas, as you say, of the underdog and who you protect.
Well, it's a very, I mean, this novel in particular, she deals with a lot of issues that I imagine would have been quite taboo during this particular period.
Yes.
I mean, the first victim is a woman disguised as a man, and most characters thought was a man who was going to marry, the female figure.
More
so
spoiling.
Yeah.
Well, I gave the spoiler.
We already
warning.
gave the ending.
I already
warning,
gave
so
it.
it's all on now.
Again.
Yeah.
And it's not too much of a spoiler because you get that in the first chapter.
you
or something
do.
like that, so
Yes.
that's revealed fairly early, so I don't feel too guilty about that.
No. Don't waste time.
No. Look, Tony was never guilty of spoilers, so why should I be? He gave terrible spoilers to me, throughout my entire time. He's kind of like, no, this happens and this. I was kind of like, I was going to watch that. But now, thank you. But yeah, I mean, to delve into some of those issues with, and almost what really struck me was there was no judgment.
No.
In this particular issue here, she just sort of presented it as, here's what happened.
Yes.
And here's a character who is female, but obviously had some sort of gender dysphoria and saw herself as male. And she sort of just depicted it this way. There was no judgment on that issue to say, well, wasn't this terrible? Or, isn't this awful? It's just kind of like, well, this happened, and isn't it a tragedy? That she died, and the characters still remember her quite fondly as quite a good person.
Yes.
And I love that they struggled with the whole gender thing. They kept saying he, and then like, oh, I meant she, and they're not quite sure what to do. And
but they sort of just accept it.
They accepted it, and I loved that. I thought, this is quite a nice society, despite the fact that she murders people. The fact that they were so accepting of this woman, they didn't judge her. They didn't say, what a perverse.
And her murder wasn't linked to, her tragedy wasn't linked to her sexuality.
It just so
identity.
happened that she got murdered, and it wasn't that a tragedy that she was murdered.
And I like the way her motive for proposing marriage to Eleanor is left open. You don't really know if she loved her, or if Eleanor sort of, who is a sexually very aggressive person, sort of pushed the issue. She just sort of leaves that open. I find that interesting too.
Yeah, I mean, it makes that character quite interesting and complex. I mean, when I was reading that, I was thinking, I wish I knew more about this character.
Yes.
What was her name?
Mountjoy.
I then went, I wish I knew more, but we never really get the backstory or any of that. We just get told this rather interesting situation.
Well, she's an explorer too. Yeah. She's not just pretending to be any old man. She's an explorer, and she's done a lot of amazing things as her male self.
And a respected scientist.
Yes.
She developed a career for herself. And she was quite an interesting character. Yeah. And by all intents and purposes, she actually did trust Eleanor, because we're told in the story that the murder was very unexpected to her. There was no cries of alarm or anything like that.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's how she can kill her.
Yeah, and there's something quite sad about that for me, because I went, what was your last moment like? So for me, it was quite a moving story.
Yes, I agree.
But at the same time,
aspect of it.
I had to look up.
Deepens it, doesn't it?
I had to look up one of the references in there, because they made a reference to the Brides in the Bath murder, which I had never heard of.
There was a lot in the Gladys Mitchell stories. Yes, he was a serial murderer of his wives.
And this one almost seemed to be based on that, but used that real life and horrid situation to turn into something actually much more interesting and complex, to deal with issues that are actually much more interesting and complex. So I thought that was absolutely fascinating.
There's an interesting link too. Water is imagery, and death by water runs through a lot of the novels. So various drownings and things, and it's interesting that that terrible thing for a witch, they ducked them in the pond, and if they drowned, they were innocent, and if they survived, they were witches and they were burnt to death. That kind of thing.
So that nice little catch-22.
That lovely little catch-22. That's right. So that death by drowning thing, it's a kind of a motif throughout all the stories. So that's how Eleanor Mountjoy is killed.
But that's another mythological kind of thing.
It is indeed, yes. And that she eventually gets a Watson figure, Laura. So the two of them are female, versions in some ways of Holmes and Watson, and Laura is the Amazon. So Mrs. Bradley is the Sibylline, witch-like crone.
Almost Medea-like too.
Yes. And Laura is the Amazon. She's like Artemis. She's the huntress too, but she's an amazing swimmer. And in lots of the plots, Laura saves the day by, diving into boiling waters. And there's this very adventurous kind of aspect to it. But it's all to do with waters. And she knew the waterways of England well. She was an expert in architectural history. So I take it just from the endless descriptions of the countryside, that she knew it like the back of her hand. And that's one of the beautiful things of the novels for me. As they go through, there's these amazing set piece descriptions of rivers and the beautiful water flowers beside them, and Laura's usually swimming like a fish through it all. So it's fascinating. It's all, she doesn't push it in this kind of pseudo-intellectual way, but just those, as you say, those mythic, it's like a tapestry. It's all woven in, and you pick up bits of it, and it just deepens the formula, because they're formula-driven things, as all detective stories are. But it just deepens and deepens.
But I think she's quite willing to play and butt up against the formula, I suppose, because what struck me too about reading the ones that I have is that Mrs. Bradley often doesn't appear until 50% or even more through the novel.
Well, it's chapter 9 in The Rising of the Moon. She doesn't come in.
So she's got enough. She doesn't hew that closely to the formula. She always plays with it, I think.
Yes, because the blokes are always, Holmes is always there, Whimsy's always there. They're front and centre all the time. Yes, you're right. That's an interesting. I haven't thought through the implications of that. I don't quite know what she's doing with that, except that it gives her a long setup for the murder and the social circumstances and family circumstances around the murder, I suppose. And then Mrs. Bradley comes in and puts it all to right.
I mean, while I was reading this one, I was trying to imagine what it would have been like to have read this without any knowledge of Gladys Mitchell or Mrs. Bradley. And one of the things that struck me was that it reads almost as if she wasn't intended to be the detective figure.
Oh, how perceptive you are. That's true. She wasn't.
She
Mrs.
wasn't.
Bradley wasn't. No,
it was meant to be.
Cast as.
Yeah, it was cast as who's the detective figure in this story. She just happened to be smarter than him.
Oh, good on you, Jimmy. That's well spotted. Yes.
And I thought, well, did it develop because it turned out the criminal was much more interesting than the detective in this case?
She said in the one interview she gave, she says exactly what she said. She didn't intend Mrs. Bradley to be the detective, but she just took over.
Yeah, as she does in the narrative. When she comes on, that's it. She takes over.
And Gladys Mitchell says she actually got a bit frightened of her. She said, I was too superstitious to actually get rid of her once I had her.
This is quoted in your article. I was reading it earlier. She says, personally, I should hate to meet her in real life. And then she says she simply took over, and I became so superstitious about her that I would not dare to have another detective.
Isn't that lovely?
I love the way that she writes about her as if she's, that way of dreaming up that character that just takes on a life of their own.
Yes.
I mean, one of the theories I have, which I was going to put into my thesis, just sort of ran out of time, and this would have actually kind of solidified that theory I had, is the idea between that the detective and the criminal are not that far apart. And in fact, in a lot of as we move along in time, they seem to just almost switch side over and over and over again. And she almost serves as that pinnacle point where they do actually just swap side. I mean, she seems to be the precursor of figures like Dexter at the moment. She is the criminal, but she's also the detective. But she's a very dangerous person. I mean, I can sense that. I would be afraid of her too, but
yes, me too.
Because you wouldn't know what she would do. I mean, if you commit a crime, you'd be like, dear God, let me just stay away from Mrs. Bradley for a little while, because she may just, off with his head. That's it. I'm done
before you know it.
Well, looking through Lee's excellent article here from Clues, there's a quote that you've excerpted from Butcher's Shop, which I particularly like, which is Mrs. Bradley says, "All murders are committed by lunatics." I'm referring to premeditated murders, of course. And then whoever she's talking to says,
a young boy.
Says, "Really, do you mean all murderers are mad?" And she says, "Except me, and my outrageous sanity is in itself a kind of mental defect, I sometimes think."
Isn't that lovely?
I mean, it just captures her funniness and also her complete even though she's got this humanity, but she's completely immoral in that way. She's like, oh yes, I'm a murderer. But I'm outrageously sane and mentally defective.
And her son gets her off.
Her
barrister son gets her off.
I mean, even their name, Lestrange.
Yes, it's beautiful.
They're strange, aren't they?
But that's like similar to Lestrade.
Exactly. It's sort of playing with Lestrade and Lestrange at the same time.
That's true. Oh, you're both so clever. I didn't notice that. And it's working. She's a very odd kind of mother, because you were saying that she works against the stereotypes of what an old woman, what any woman should be, which is not powerful and all the rest of it. But she's also oddly, she likes her children, but they're sort of optional extras. She lets them go their own way.
Yeah.
And she has this friendship with her son, but he's equally cold-blooded about her.
Yeah.
So she's sort of undermining all that stuff about families and, mothers and sons and all that kind of stuff.
And this is the 1920s. She doesn't operate in that kind of, domestic model of femininity at all.
At all.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think even the son admitted that, he's sort of a chip off the old block.
Yes, he gets his brilliance
he
from
gets
her.
his brilliance, but he also gets his amorality from her as well. So, at the end when he says, well, you did it, didn't you? I mean, she said, well, of course I did it. And, the two of them sort of toasted each other, sort of like, well...
I got away with murder today, what did you do?
And I helped you get away with murder, Mummy. Isn't that terrific?
There we go,
And,
we'll get to that.
On the one hand, you could see it almost as being rather cold, but on the other hand, it's a moment of, I don't know, bravado or applause or something like that. And it kind of reminded me, I don't know why, of that wonderful film, what's it called, with Cary Grant, the two old aunt who goes around killing all these old men.
I don't remember.
I know what you mean.
Arsenic
and Old Lace.
That's it.
It has that feel. It has that feel about it. It's horrific, but at the same time, it's oddly comedic.
It's funny, yeah.
Yeah, it's funny, and it does raise our own awareness of how we view people who are older or old, and I think
who are supposed. We don't see them because they're not supposed to be powerful. They're not supposed. They're old ladies.
They're meant to be frail.
It's meant to be frail, and making restorative jellies for people.
Yeah, but they can't go around lifting bodies and putting them away. Even
poisoning
in this
people.
Novel, there's the description of can you imagine little old Miss Bradley lifting the body of Eleanor and putting her into the bathtub.
And she's fine.
She's fine. And I think the detective kind of made that note that she was a nurse. And she's a nurse, and she knows exactly how to move a body without,
and she knows how to kill someone. Too.
And for me that was sort of the other interesting thing, in that the police were originally viewed as incompetent, but turned out to be actually quite competent,
very perceptive,
but not smart enough to get her.
Yes, it's like a chess game, isn't it? They nearly get her. And in fact, in that last chapter, the police is so annoyed. He's like, she did it. It's like, I know she did it. I just can't prove that she did it. And she's kind of like, I did
and
it.
that's playing with the formula too, because usually the police are idiots.
Yes.
Well, that's right. And she actually develops a very cooperative relationship with the police. She actually eventually ends up working for the Home Office, so she does take on an institutional power in the later novels. She's more of a lone wolf here, which I actually quite like. And Inspector Gavin, who's a Scotland Yard detective, he marries Laura, who is her companion secretary, partner in crime.
Champion swimmer.
That's right. That's right. And Laura's relationship with Mrs. Bradley always comes first. Even though she adores her husband and her children and all the rest of it, but her career, this is a new woman thing.
Yeah.
Because her work with Mrs. Bradley is her career. And he knows enough just to let them get on with it. So that I think you're right. She's taking on the stereotypes of that really quite abrasive relationship between the official police and the amateur detective, and she's rewriting that too into a genuine kind of partnership of equals.
Yeah, I think when you read it from that perspective, you see that what she's doing the entire time wasn't to actually say how stupid they were, but actually to mislead them and to to make her case even more solid. So she was planning things very, very early on. She was planting the seeds of her own acquittal, pretty much very, very early on. So she was playing with them, and they knew that she was playing with them, but they couldn't quite outsmart her.
Yeah. And didn't you love his name, Inspector Boring?
Boring, I loved it. There's that quote from Cass says, you may be boring, but you're anything but boring. I thought, these wonderful names, Lestrange and
Boring.
And she plays lots and lots of games. She really knows the language, and and there's epigraphs all through the later novels, and she's clearly she taught English and history. She's very well read, and she just loves the language.
And for me, anyway, there's a shadow of Wilkie Collins. Perhaps I don't know the novel now.
Moonstone.
The Moonstone.
The Moonstone.
Yep. In this particular story,
Oh, Miss Clark.
Yeah, all of them. Like even the amateur detective, all of them seem to somehow.
Yes.
There's. I would love to, when I have the time, if I ever have the time, sit down and try to plot the similarities and differences between the Moonstone and this particular novel, because I can see. I don't know if it's there, but there's certainly influences or underpinnings of the Moonstone throughout.
And it's interesting, isn't it, that the detective, who seems to be very Holmesian and he's going to solve everything, he fails in the Moonstone.
He does fail.
So that's interesting. But I thought you were going to make the connection with the mad Miss Clack in the Moonstone, who has that kind of hysterical. I find her a very sympathetic character, and I think Collins did too.
Yes.
And she becomes this weirdly evangelical, religious maniac, because there's nowhere for her to go. She has no job. She can't get financial independence, and it sort of sends her mad. And I think you're right. There's an interesting connection with Eleanor, who is who comes across as prim, and she's got the glasses, and she's very proper, but she's actually very sexually. She's a creature of desire, so I think that kind of versions of madness coming out in the novels. I think you're right. I think probably she would have liked Collins.
And there's also the whole drugs and sort of coming. There was a lot of parallels there when I was reading it.
That's right.
There's some very strong parallel, but because Steph was rushing me so much to read this novel, I didn't really have time to sit on it and stew on it and think about the idea.
Jimmy finished the novel about 3 minutes before we started this podcast.
Don't rat on you. You rat.
No.
She would take any chance to
I will.
down.
Well, can I say something that I didn't like about the novel?
Yes.
Yes.
Because it really did worry me. And what do you two think? I was worried that, in a sense, Eleanor got punished for her sexual desires.
Yes.
Because she loved Bertie, this rather silly young male who she finds attractive, but he doesn't like her. He likes Dorothy, therefore Dorothy is in danger of being killed, blah, blah, blah. And it really bothered me a little bit that one of the reasons Eleanor has to die is that her sexual desires cannot be accommodated. So Mrs. Bradley doesn't use her wonderful powers to find a way to get Eleanor sorted out. Eleanor has to die. And I was just a bit worried about that it came close to that. It happens in New Woman fiction.
Yeah.
You kill off the sexually transgressive one. It happens in
Romance of the Shop.
The Shop. It happens in a lot. You wouldn't expect it to happen in New Woman fiction. So a kind of conservatism, I think, creeps in to the plot that I'm not sure I like. And it happens in the Saltmarsh Murders too, the same thing. It's a woman who is beyond the pale because she desires, she's aggressive. And that bothered me.
It did bother me too, I have to say. I'm not sure how I feel about it because I haven't read as much in the Gladys Mitchell archive as well. I'm not sure if that was a kind of plot narrative convenience or whether there was some kind of deeper kind of message there. But yes, it does seem to be the kind of final frontier. She seems to be Mrs. Bradley's pushing at so many kind of stereotypes and kind of cultural depictions of women, but at the same time she's completely asexual. She's got children, but you don't get a sense of her as ever being a sexual character.
I get the reverse. I think she was a pretty wild child in her youth, but she's sort of
mellowed.
She's gone beyond all that.
Well, I haven't read as many as you have certainly, but it does worry me that the sexual woman is the one who has to die.
It bothered me a little bit, but what I thought was happening was that she was actually pointing out the hypocrisy of the situation, because you have two characters very much contrasted and juxtaposed against each other. You have Eleanor
Yeah.
and Bertie.
Yes.
And right after Bertie describes about Eleanor's, horrible, really sexual, horrible
Yes.
sexual advances towards
Comes
him.
into his bed.
He comes into all that. He does the exact
Good
same thing
offense.
to Dorothy. Like
That's
in the
right.
next chapter, he does the exact same thing
But
to
he's a
Dorothy.
man, so it's
but he's a
okay.
man,
He's a
and he
man.
gets away with it.
Yes.
And Dorothy just sort of
Yes.
chides him, "Oh, you naughty, naughty boy,"
Yes.
sort of thing.
And poor
But
Eleanor is
Eleanor has to
seething
get
in the background.
Yeah, and I think the novel sets us up to sympathise with Eleanor, almost as to say that society doesn't know how to treat.
I don't know.
character
I
like
think
this.
that's a wonderful way out, and I'm not sure I buy it. I'm not sure, because that's the way to let her off the hook.
No,
That it becomes social critique.
I wasn't thinking of trying to let her off the hook in that sense. What I was thinking, for me, that was
you
my
saw-
reading of it.
Yeah, and I wonder how
Yeah.
much of that is informed by your position in time.
Yeah, quite
like
possibly.
the
you know,
21st century reader.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, we
but-
don't want women to be
no,
killed just because they want somebody who doesn't want them.
yeah, it is very problematic because all sort of sexuality in women do get killed.
Yes.
So you have
Yes.
Mountjoy getting killed.
Yes.
For pretty much very similar reasons,
Yeah.
except for very different circumstances.
Yeah.
And you have Eleanor being killed for the same
Yeah.
reason, but
Yeah.
all the men get off.
Yeah.
And so, is it a problem, or is it just
Yes.
endemic of the time
Yes.
that
Yes.
of that particular
But
period?
even in that reading, then Mrs. Bradley is reinforcing those nasty realities because
She is.
it's Eleanor who's dead, not Bertie.
Not
And
Bertie.
he attempts to kill her.
Yeah, he does.
He nearly drowns Eleanor.
And she protects him.
Yes.
And that's the part that has
Isn't
always
it-
bothered me
but
because
they just brushed that off.
Yeah.
Oh yes. Well, of course.
Well,
Bertie.
that's the part that actually bothered me more than anything else in this particular novel. The way all the female characters seem to let Bertie off. They all
That's
seem
true.
to
That's
protect
true.
him, or
Yes.
even Mrs.
Yes.
Bradley protects him.
Yes.
The first thing
Yes.
she says to him is, "You better find out what you were doing between this hour and that hour, because they're going to be asking you."
Yes.
Yeah, so
So
get your
almost
story
like
straight.
Yeah, get your story. So it's almost like she's warning him. Every character seems to be protecting Bertie.
Yes.
And
he's-
for me, he's not a particularly sympathetic
No, I
character.
no,
I
no,
don't
I thought he-
particularly like him as a character.
No, I don't.
And so I'm quite disgusted
Yeah.
that all the female in this particular world seem to desire and want to protect him.
Yes.
Even the girl that he
Yes.
doesn't love him back in that particular way still
She's
protects him.
protective of him.
But then that's an open question, isn't it? Is that critique of that kind of
Yes.
society where men are protected and
Yes.
women are not?
Yes.
Or is it actually reinforcing
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, and that's a part I'm not
Yes.
sure about.
Yeah, me too. I think it's genuinely open. I think you'd have to do really close textual analysis to try and figure out where the politics of the novel actually lie.
Another project for you. Possibly.
Another project for me. Yes, I can see. How about we could write. Another.
We could
This could be an
moonlight
article
as
in
a
itself.
three of us. The three musketeers.
Before we have to wrap up.
Yes.
Did Mrs. Bradley change over time? Because she remains in the novels from 1929 to 1983.
Yes.
That's a huge chunk of time. Does she change?
Yes, she does. She becomes more of the wise woman, and all the cackling and prodding people in the ribs and the weird clothes, they do disappear. It's a bit disappointing.
Yeah.
But I don't think she ever really repudiates the power of Mrs. Bradley. She is still the powerful one. She becomes Dame Adela Lestrange or whatever. She gets knighted, whatever the Queen.
The Queen does that thing
Yeah,
that she
that
does.
thing,
Yeah.
So she becomes a more conventional figure of the wise woman as the novels progress.
Funny that she did that as Gladys Mitchell was becoming an
Yeah,
older
as she
woman.
becomes older, I think you've got it in one. I think she just mellows herself.
Yeah.
Because, as I said at the beginning, she's a very young woman writing this old woman and playing with all these wonderful ideas of power and agency. And I think she just mellows herself. And she's the later novels by most people agree, they're just not as good. But there's at least 30 of them that are utterly dazzling and beyond bizarre in their plots and the strangeness of them.
I think that's a really strong recommendation for our listeners to go and find some.
What a great! Because she was saying they're endemics. They're still in print.
They're
some
still
of
in
them.
print. Yeah, there's
Yes.
the ones that I've read have been in that. Who's the publisher, Jimmy?
Vintage.
In the vintage
Yes.
editions, and they're usually I've found the earlier novels.
They
Yeah.
are. The later ones, I've trawled the internet and I've been able to buy old library copies and everything of the later ones, but most of those are out of print. I think you can get them on Kindle and that kind of thing.
They're
But that's
quite
not the same as a real book.
No.
they're quite widely available. I've seen them
Yeah.
in Abby's bookshop in the city and so
Yeah.
forth. So they're quite. It's not. They seem to be coming back.
I should say a friend of mine sent me this, an American friend of mine. It's an edition of Speedy Death by the Hogarth Press.
Oh, nice.
So there's a
There's a
sort
nice
of a Bloomsbury link
a
there.
Virginia Woolf connection.
It's late. It's 1988, but it's got a really bizarre cover that doesn't relate in any way to the story. But I value that enormously. I don't, it's just a wonderful edition of it. But yeah, so. Yes, please, people, go out.
Let's
and
champion
read.
the rediscovery
Yes,
of Gladys.
Read Gladys.
I like her so much better than Dorothy Sayers.
So do I.
I'm not a Dorothy Sayers fan.
No,
This
I
is
get
not
it.
the first time Steph has mentioned her
No, I
dislike
know.
of
Well,
Dorothy Sayers
we've
in the
joined,
podcast.
Yeah. Oh, right. No. Well, we both have very mixed feelings about Dorothy Sayers.
So we would much prefer people go out and read.
And
Gladys Mitchell.
please read Gladys. You'll love Gladys, even though we've spoilt the first one. For
Yeah,
you.
there are like 70 years
60-something.
more of
And she
novels.
also used male pseudonyms. She's got other detective stories, and we don't have time to go written as a male.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I think that's about all we have time for today.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Lee.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you both. It's pure bliss to sit and
I know.
talk to people who've read Gladys Mitchell.
Thank you, Jimmy, and thank you for subjecting to my bullying and reading this novel in 2 hours.
Yes, as much as I hated that experience, I loved the book. So, thank
Isn't
you for the
that lovely?
recommendation.
I'm so thrilled. I was a bit worried. I thought, is he going to like this? And you did.
I did. I loved
That's
it.
perfect.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Excellent. So 3 A+ recommendations.
Yes.
Thank you everyone for listening. This has been another episode of From the Lighthouse. I want to remind you, if you have a moment, to please rate and review us on iTunes. It helps other people to find the podcast. And so they can read Gladys Mitchell too, and she can become a bestseller, as she should always have been. Michelle, we miss you. See you again in 2 weeks. Bye.